Hello, Matthew. Hello, Matthew. Are you there?
Yes.
Oh, I see. I'm muted. That's why I couldn't hear you. Sorry about that.
No problem.
Hello, Matthew. Are you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Excellent. Hold on just a second. I'm probably catching my own audio from YouTube. Hold on.
Okay.
Okay. Sorry about that. That should all be sorted out now.
Okay.
I have made you your host of the meeting. If you want to take charge and put up your first slide, you can. Otherwise, we can keep this this placeholder slide for your flyer up until Mike introduces you. I'll leave that choice to you.
Okay. Yeah, I'll leave it until we start.
Okay. Well, great. As you know, we are out on YouTube right now, and I will start the recording for the Zoom cloud recording right at 2:59, and then I'll send Mike a message telling him that we're recording, and then he will kick it off, say hello everyone, introduce you, talk about what's going to happen, and then we'll roll into the talk. And I will stop recording once Mike at the end. Sorry, Dr. Binford at the end of your talk will sort of give you the outro, give a preview of what's going to happen next, and then I'll stop the recording. So that's how this works, and I'll just be standing by for keeping everything running behind the scenes.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Hey, Matthew, you ready to go?
Yes, sir.
What I'll do, Matthew, is I have a short little introduction for you,
Sure.
and I'll turn it over to you.
All right.
Now, your topic's pretty interesting to me. I worked with a guy named Terry McCabe from University of Colorado, who's worked in northern Kenya, actually, in the Turkana region, which has several different pastoralist groups, always been at war with each other, but then people started coming in and arming them with AK-47s. And of course, the violence just escalated after that. And Terry tells some really crazy stories. And one time he drove over a hill and there were two groups about to have a battle with each other, and they saw his car coming. They thought he was the police or the army or something, so they all ran away. So that didn't turn out to be bad.
Over there. Well, what's his name? I'll write his name down.
Terry McCabe, McCabe.
Okay.
He's a professor of anthropology at the University of Colorado.
Okay.
And we worked with him in southern Kenya and northern Tanzania near, what was the name of the national park? It was Tarangire National Park, which has some of the really serious wildlife-human conflict. And we were studying how people were behaving around the park as a consequence of the park being there. One of the things they were doing is the Maasai, who are pastoralists, as you know, were actually we're plowing agricultural fields to stop the migration of the animals in and out of the park. And it was very interesting because to see the Maasai guys with their red robes and everything driving tractors was a fairly substantial shakeup in one's worldview.
Interesting.
The clock just ticked over to 3 o'clock. So good afternoon and welcome to the 5th colloquium of the fall semester. Today we'll hear from Matthew Pflaum about political violence amongst pastoralists in North and West Africa. Matthew's a PhD student, so faculty please fill out the evaluation forms and send them to me. With multiple prior degrees. He has a Bachelor of Arts in both biology and physical anthropology from Grinnell College in Iowa. Several UF faculty members are Grinnell alums, including Dr. Mark Brenner in geological sciences. It's a good school. An MPH in global health and infectious disease from Emory University, and a Master of Science in African Studies and International Development from the University of Edinburgh. I hope I pronounced that right, Pete. So without further delay, Matthew, you have the floor.
Thank you, Dr. Binford. Thank you guys very much for attending. I'm really happy to be here. Hope you enjoy my talk. Glad you could make it. So I'm going to share my screen. And all right. So yeah, I'm going to be talking about political violence and pastoralism in North and West Africa. So starting by showing some recent media clips from some pretty tragic events that have happened in the past 2 years. Perhaps you heard about these, but there's been a series of massacres in parts of the Sahel involving ethnic tension, extremism, communal violence. And so some of these have involved pastoralists. The specific case was one of the most egregious. It was in Ouagadougou in Mali last year. And 157 Fulani herdsmen were massacred. They suspect the ethnic group committing the atrocity was Dogon. They formed groups called Dozo militia, which are traditional hunters and warriors. So again, this is an example of how pastoralists are involved in violence in the region. So I just want to make a caveat before I start that I think every discipline and every topic has their kind of underlying foundational question. And for violence, it's why are people violent? For environmental science, it might be why is climate change happening? So I'm not going to dare to answer that question, but here in this talk and the research I'm doing, I'm going to try to examine the pastoralist involvement in violence. And again, this is, it's related to my PhD kind of background. but it's also for a project I'm doing now for OECD, specifically about spatializing pastoralist violence. In this talk, I'm going to use the term pastoralist violence because of the coding nature of the database I'm using. Pastoralist violence does not actually mean violence committed by pastoralists. So it means there's a violent event in which pastoralists are involved. Because of coding and because of the difficulty of the directionality of violent events, the database that I use does not actually have directionality. You can infer it, but it doesn't mean one group is attacking another. So when I speak of violent events, it means there were pastoralists involved on one side or the other. I just want to make that clear. So basically what I'm going to be talking about is spatial and temporal evolution and patterns for pastoralist violence in the region over time. There's a lot of scales and levels on which to examine violence, from the, national level, so kind of macro scale institutions and, stability of countries, which you may hear about, Mali is unstable, parts of Nigeria are unstable, down to individual, why are people making choices to do violence, small towns, rural areas of Africa. So here is kind of the reason I'm interested in this is because, as I'll mention in a bit, for me, I call it the pastoralist paradox, which is pastoralists are widely associated with violence, but there's not that much research into the violence that they're committing. So it's not that people don't study it, they do, but it's usually at very small scale. There was a lot written about some of the massacres, the ethnic tensions that have happened. There's a lot of social research into it. But again, in terms of rigorous scientific empirical evidence, like all of the violence that pastors are involved in, it hasn't really been done. There's a lot of challenges to doing that. So the temporal and spatial scale are obviously really important to understanding pastoralist violence in the region. And that's what I'm going to talk about, where are pastoralists involved in violence in this region? How has it changed over time? So I'm not getting into, a question I would really like to answer. Why are they violent? What are the social things? That comes later. I'd hope to look at that at some point, but this is more just analysis of their involvement. So some of the significance is, why are pastoralists in this region associated with violence? Is there evidence to support these assumptions and associations? I'll talk a bit about the assumptions of pastoralists in a bit, but then the main thing is spatializing pastoralist violence in the region, which again, has been looked at, but not really at a comprehensive level. And neither does this study, but, looking at all violence of pastoralists in the region, in the continent, it's very difficult. I mean, first identifying who is pastoralist is a challenge in itself, but this hasn't really been done at a very strong empirical level. So the region of North and West Africa includes 21 countries. So this is the scale that I'm using for this analysis. There's a huge variation here in that, the countries vary a lot in environment and population and stability and economic development, level of pastoralism. So I'll get into that in a bit, and there are countries that are very stable and have very low levels of violence in this region, though some have experienced very bad violence like Sierra Leone. But in general, there is a lot of discussion now about violence in the Sahel. That's not all of North and West Africa, but there are certain problematic countries like Burkina Faso, Mali, and Nigeria specifically. And there has been, in the past 20 years, quite a lot of dispersion, so transnational spread. So, a big question is, how is pastoralist violence in this region varying spatially? And I don't go through it so much today, but I'm also looking at some case studies in Central Sahel and Lake Chad, which are the kind of the worst affected areas. So just very briefly, I don't have time to get into a lot of this, but this is probably the region with the highest pastoralist rates in the world. This could be exaggerated. As I said, there's very hard to measure pastoralists. Also, they're very rapidly sedentarizing, as people are probably familiar. But some of these countries have relatively significant levels. Mali, Chad, Mauritania. Even Nigeria, though, has maybe 15 or 20 million Fulani. Fulani are one of the largest ethnic groups in the world. What I mean by that is like a minority group. So, there's 20 to 30 million of them. Hausa are another very big group, but they're a very large, significant group found in probably 12 to 15 countries. So definition, again, there's a wide spectrum of definitions. It's one of those things we know what they are, but it's hard to define. I've had people ask me before if I mean the people who work in churches when I talk about pastoralists, in addition to do they exist or what are they? But generally extensive livestock breeding and mobility. So these are kind of two dimensions of them that are really important. They have relationship with livestock, and they're mobile. More technical definition, finely honed symbiotic relationship between local ecology, domesticated livestock, and people. I mentioned paradox before. Yet another paradox is that there are long-term tensions with other groups and pastoralists. However, there's also long-term harmony. So again, how do we really reconcile this? But for thousands of years, pastoralists and other groups have coexisted. Well, before 4,000 years ago, everyone was pastoralist, but they have coexisted because they needed to. Basically, pastoralists, even now, are very large contributors to GDP, agricultural GDP, in terms of their livestock and milk and trade. But they don't produce everything. So their specialization is in livestock. So meats, milk, hides, things like that. For long periods, it was very difficult for them to get agriculture, especially because of where they live, right? So desert regions. So they've always relied on trade, and they have gone along pretty well. That said, there have also been, eruptions of violence over time, conflicts over land, resource competition in scarce regions. Some of these regions are very desolate. So so both of these have existed over time, harmony and this violence. So just talking, I'll get into some of the reasons why violence, but some ethnic groups and state authorities do have the potential to capture and control resources, power, and access, and this does provoke anti-state sentiments. I'll get into the literature very briefly, but I don't have time to go over all these. But that leads to kind of marginalization, which is maybe the most mentioned reason why pastoralists have tensions with other groups. They're marginalized. Okay, what does that really mean? Again, huge range of this. Some countries are better than others. Some pastoralist groups don't have that much tension. Some have a lot of tension. This has led to some assumptions. So if you ask quite a lot of West African people about Fulani, they're not going to say very nice things. That's again its own generalization, but that's true that they're not very well thought of. The photos I included in the cover were from a Fulani subgroup called Bororo in Cameroon. So this is an example of a group that is extremely marginalized. People have written about it since the 70s. They're very, very marginalized. Most I met don't have papers, documentation of residency or registration, birth registration, land titling, even though they've lived there for decades, sometimes 80 years. So this leads to problems. Fortunately, in Cameroon, most of that marginalization does not lead to violence. They're just basically susceptible to excessive fines, to harassment, to constant conflict with farmers, on which the state usually takes the farmer side. So yeah, marginalization can lead to problems, and it does lead to the capacity for them to join violent groups or participate in violence. Some other issues are, state neglect. It was a big factor in the MNLA rebellion in northern Mali in 2012 by the Tuareg. At least that's what they said, and what a lot of people say is that the state just neglected us. And from working in eastern Cameroon, it's the poorest region of Cameroon. It's where a lot of the Fulani live. There's simply not that many institutions. There's not a lot of investment. There's not a lot of infrastructure. It can lead to problems. So other things are like policies, resource competition. This is getting exacerbated by migration and population growth. This is evident in Nigeria, where you have pastoralist groups moving southward. So indigenous and autochthony groups, this is also leading to problems. And then the last one, non-state actors. This is really important because, under Salihan and other theories, violence is getting really messy. Let's just say that. So World War II, not that it wasn't messy, but you had a lot of states fighting and their militaries. This is not how violence works these days. You have, as in my study, over 4,000 groups that are involved in violence. So you have a lot of militias that easily form. You have communal militias, ethnic militias, you have extremist groups, you have self-defense groups, you have all these militias associated with the government, you have civilian groups. So it's very, very complicated. You have multinational actors now even. So so just really briefly, there are pastoralists who, again, when I say pastoralists, I don't mean all pastoralists. There's been documented evidence of some pastoralists that identify with the values and ideologies of the rhetoric of extremist groups. The reason is because these extremist groups, again, whether they actually believe this or are, espousing this to recruit people, because recruitment is very important to them, but they are giving a lot of anti-state, anti-elite, pro-pastoralist messages in their rhetoric, which attracts pastoralists. Anti-state, because obviously a lot of extremist groups are into jihad and having sovereignty, having their own territory. Anti-elite, because they have a lot of anti-Western ideology, and the pro-pastoralists. It's not exactly clear, but some of these extremist groups do have history of pastoralism. Some are Arab groups that are pastoralists. Other times they could just be saying that they're pro-pastoralist to recruit people, which has happened. There's been quite a lot of writing about revenge attacks and cycles of violence. It's been called recently in a paper I read, hybridization of violence. So this is when extremist groups attack a community, a group of people, and certain members of the extremist group are identified as one ethnicity, and that leads to a separate kind of back and forth of violence between those ethnicities. This has happened with Fulani a lot. I'm not an expert of extremist groups, but I do study them a bit, and generally they're not like one ethnicity. There are examples of extremist groups who are primarily a certain ethnicity, but in general they tend to recruit pretty widely. So this associating a certain ethnicity, particularly Fulani, with a extremist group is not really justified, but it has happened, and it leads to its own cycles. And part of the communal violence in those media reports often stem from that. So in the Central Sahel, the region of this region that I study, Mali, Burkina Faso, you have a lot of grievances by pastoralists. The MNLA in Mali was provoking the rebellion 8 years ago. In Niger, you've had similar grievances. In northern Nigeria, you've had a long history of Fulani and other groups trying to establish sovereignty, rights, jihad. A couple groups in this region that target pastoralists. Some are founded by pastoralists. Some have pastoralist leaders, and some make a big effort to recruit pastoralists. Ansarul Islam is a very good example in northern Burkina Faso, which targets Fulani because they think there's a lot of Fulani in that region. So it makes sense, numerically. Also, some Fulani are susceptible for the reasons that I've mentioned. Katibat Masina is another one. And then some of these other groups, these are a mix of militias, rebel groups, and extremist groups, which are also recruiting pastoralists, Akim, Jainim, MNJ, Ansaru, Fars. So just one really quick example from Nigeria. One year, pastoralists complained that the state failed to punish or investigate the killings of over 1,000 pastoralists and the theft of 2 million cattle. This is from a recent report by Broadham and McDonald. All right, so the data, just really quickly, this is ACLED, so it's probably the gold standard for political violence in the world. Every violent event in Africa since 1997, they've expanded to other regions. Actually, it's been used recently. I saw in a few reports about protests in the United States with the recent protests for Black Lives Matters and stuff like that. So the reason it's so good is because they have a lot of different variables. As I mentioned, one limitation is it doesn't have directionality, but it does have a lot of temporal information, spatial information, notes, corroborating the events, different actors. So basically, I downloaded all the events that were violent because they have non-violent events, but I just downloaded the violent ones. And there were over 4,000 groups. The first step was to identify all of these. And then I analyzed them spatially and temporally using ArcMaps data in Excel. So I identified 188 total pastoralist groups among the over 4,000 involved in violent events. Every country had pastoralist violent events except for 3, Gambia, Guinea-Bissau, and Liberia. So this is interesting that there are pastoralists involved in violence, either, again, as assailant or, as a victim or assailant. In all the countries. Again, there's a huge range that I'll get into. And if we look at the violent events, fatalities, and groups, you see that it is, significant. 13% of violent events, 16% of fatalities, and around 5% of groups. So again, I don't have an accurate number for pastoralists in the region. I've read around 200 million for all of Africa. For this region, your guess is as good as mine. I just have no idea. But, they say there's around 30 million Fulani. Again, how many of them are pastoralists? There's 5 million Tuareg, more or less. How many are pastoralists? But the estimate would be probably like 2 to 10% of this region is pastoralists. So as far as the groups, that's pretty consistent with their representation in the population. And again, fatalities and violent events, it looks like a lot. But the issue is in in this part of the world, there's an assumption that pastoralists are responsible for all the violence, right? So you look at Middle Belt, it's just all blamed on the Fulani. So the question is, I don't really get to answer that now, but it's kind of a long-term goal, is how does that correlate with does that mean there's a lot of significant contribution by pastoralists? It's kind of a long-term question. It is a number that shows that pastoralists are involved in violence. Again, to what level we'll see. But so this figure is it's kind of hard to read. People have told me I need to make this clearer, but if anyone has any advice about how to show this. So these are all the groups. They're actually consolidated. So it's about half as many groups as actually are found in the database. To explain this, hold on, let me get my marker. So to explain what I mean, so if you take Fulani ethnic militia, in the coding, there's a group called Fulani ethnic militia. The issue is there's probably like 80 of these, maybe 60 to 80, because sometimes there's many iterations. What I mean is there can be Fulani ethnic militia in parentheses Burkina Faso, Fulani ethnic militia Nigeria. Sometimes they have secondary actors. Sometimes they're individual group. So I've consolidated these in this chart. So for making it easy, anything with a star means there was multiple versions of that group, but I just consolidated them. But you see that there's these countries here where there's quite a lot of groups. Mali, again, with just a huge amount of pastoralist groups. And again, Mali is a country that we hear a lot about pastoralists with Tuareg and Fulani. You have the three here: Gambia, Guinea-Bissau, and Liberia with none. And then you have quite a lot with not a lot of pastoralist groups, just a couple. So you do see a pretty significant variation here. So this is really important, transnational violence. So why does this matter? Violence, if you read Salihan and others, has a lot of capacity for spreading transnationally now, just related to how violence has changed over time. The other thing is with pastoralists who are defined almost as inherently transnational, you do see that there is a capacity for it to spread transnationally. Why? Because these groups often live in different countries. They often have associated groups or settlements across states, and also they are somewhat mobile, so they might have more capacity to operate transnationally. I highlighted the three that are the most transnational. So the two Fulani types of groups, again, these are the iterations I was talking about. So in the coding, there's a Fulani ethnic militia in all these countries. Now, are they a unified group? No. So just really quickly, I want to explain anything I have here in quotes is not a real group. What I mean is there was a violent event and someone said, oh, it was a Fulani ethnic group that committed that event. Now, is that a legitimate group? No. It's not like ATNMC, which is an actual, legitimate group. I don't mean they're like registered in the country, but they have, actual ideology. They have some territory. They're kind of a real group that is designated. The ones in quotes are kind of coded as that in the database, either because that's what the media said or that's what the observers called them. But we can't say Fulani ethnic militia in Benin and Cameroon are the same group. They're really not a legitimate group that way. It doesn't mean they're not Fulani. What it means is there's no real connection between, even within one country. So this is kind of a problem in the database that we don't know who a lot of these groups are. So but you do see that Fulani ethnic militia of one kind or the other is involved in quite a lot of violence across the region. And then pastoralist is even more problematic because all it means is that in the database, this was coded, the violent event, as pastoralists. So we don't know what pastoralists or who. And they were in almost every country, basically. And then the other ones that are transnational, some interesting ones because we hear so much about Tuareg and Fulani. Dausahak, not mentioned that much, Tubu, Saharari. Again, so there's some other groups. They're not that high levels of violence, but they are important in that you never really read that much about these groups. Most people probably haven't even heard of them, but they are involved in transnational violence. Just really quickly, this Katibat Masina, they have recruited heavily from local Fulani. They're disgruntled with state neglect and violence. There's a lot of communal tensions that have hybridized with violent extremism. There's ties that are developing between pastoralists and jihadists. Again, there's a lot of reasons behind this. I don't want to get into all the reasons. I don't think anyone really fully understands all of it, but there has been some evidence for this. So I just want to, I'm focusing on pastoralist violence for this talk. I just want to briefly give overview that if we compare on the left side, we have all violent events in the region, 97 to 2020. On the right, we have just pastoralist ones. So you see that there's less pastoralist violence. There are fewer dots. Whoops. So, but you do have these two regions that seem to correspond. Again, Central Sahel is the one with Mali, Burkina Faso, Lake Chad Basin with Nigeria. So you do see that with generalized violence and with pastoralist violence, you do have two regions that are really constituting a pretty big amount of violence. Pastoralist violence is not so widespread in the region, although you do have a few events throughout a lot of the countries, but you don't, the Sierra Leone war didn't really involve pastoralists. You have quite a lot of violence in Cote d'Ivoire, in Ghana, which was not pastoralist, but yeah, you do have these two regions that are really, there's a lot of emphasis on these regions, but for pastoralists, it's true that these two regions obviously need some more examination, and in terms of policy, of course, should be emphasized. So here we have the share of violence per country, percentage of events and percentage of fatalities. And so what you see is a huge range. So Mali is very significant. Mali has quite a lot of violence. I think the second or third most in the region. And so a significant amount of that is associated with pastoralists. Again, a lot of the violence in the past decade has been provoked by the MNLA rebellion, which had a lot of ramifications. The massacre that I mentioned in the first slide led to the stepping down of the prime minister of Mali and the dissolution of the military. And there's a coup a couple months ago where the entire government was replaced by the military. So these have real world ramifications. The violence that was, the conflict that was provoked by the rebellion has actually, now kind of gradually shifted to a lot of extremism and communal violence, which involves pastoralists to some extent. But you see with, 60 to 70% of the violence associated with pastoralists, it's pretty significant. Burkina Faso is the other one. Burkina Faso had very little violence until 4 years ago, and then just got a huge amount with JNIM and other groups moving in there. Again, a large amount involves pastoralists because there's so much activity with Fulani in the north. Some of these other countries is kind of misleading because Benin and Togo had very little violence, like fewer than 200 fatalities. So what that means is with very little violence, if pastoralists were involved with a couple events, then they'll have a significant amount. But the Burkina Faso and Mali one are really important. Nigeria is an interesting case because so much emphasis on Nigerian violence is fixated on the communal violence in the Middle Belt and pastoralists. 10 to 20% is significant, but it's almost like you would expect, at least half or even sometimes 70, 80% of violence to be pastoralists because you hear so much about it. But again, pastoralists are involved in violence in Nigeria, but with 3 separate conflicts there, with Boko Haram, with Middle Belt, with the oil delta. You have other things going on. So pastoralists are involved, but again, sometimes you hear about it in the media as though, it's all pastoralist violence. It's not. The groups per country, again, pastoralist groups are involved in violence, but other than a couple of these countries, Mali is an important one, Chad, Burkina Faso, Nigeria, you do have a couple groups, but again, it's not so widespread. You also see the 3 with no pastoralist groups. So pastoralist groups are important, but they're by no means the majority of violent groups. It's something to think about. All right, the number of events changes slightly. There's some consistency here with the similar countries. Mali, Nigeria, Burkina Faso, the big problematic countries in terms of this. And you do see countries like Mali and Burkina Faso with a huge proportion of the violent events being related to pastoralists. So it's something to consider for policy, for interventions, things like that. Fatalities, again, similar trend. Mali, Burkina Faso, Nigeria. In Libya, you kind of got, Libya and Niger, you got not quite as much as those three, but you do have a significant amount. And again, some of these countries, again, to mention the variation, you have very little violence. All violence is bad, but when you get down to Guinea-Bissau and Gambia and Ghana, you have violence, but it's nothing like what's going on in Mali and Nigeria. So I examined the top 10 groups. And again, I mentioned in the kind of advertisement for this that these 5 groups are responsible for quite a significant amount. So in these 10 groups, you actually have a mix. You have all 3 of the category. So I made my own categories of actors. Basically an extremist group, any type of militia. So that's like communal militia or rebel group. And then you have civilian groups. That could be anyone, farmer, aid worker, journalist, ethnic group. So you actually have a mix here. You have 3, 3, and 4. So the most common of the top 10 was a militia. And I do think militias are really the problematic issue in a lot of this violence. You have 3 extremist groups and you have 3 ethnic groups or political groups, civilian groups, basically. Did you see the top 2 are Fulani ethnic militia, Fulani ethnic group? Again, the purpose of this research is to understand pastoralist violence in the region, and Fulani are involved. Again, what to make of that? Fulani are the most populous ethnicity in West Africa, other than Hausa, which actually are somewhat related to Fulani. But so to say they're the most violent group, what does it really mean? It is problematic. There's a lot of research into Fulani violence. It's not the only thing that matters. There's other violence going on, and again, I think we should understand how, where, and why Fulani are involved in this violence, because we saw the first massacre against Fulani. It's not that they're always victims. There has been Fulani have perpetrated violence, of course, as well. So again, I hope people don't take this as, oh, this proves that Fulani are the main issue. There are other groups here, and again, we need to learn more about how Fulani are involved in these 2 capacities: Fulani ethnic groups and militias. Are they attacking? Where are they attacking? Are they victims? Why are they victims? There's a lot of questions about that. All right, so there has been a proliferation of actors. This is consistent with how violence has changed in the world. I circled this, a lot of this is related to, some of the events that have gone on in the last decade with Boko Haram, with MNLA rebellion in Mali. But you see around the 2010s that there was a huge spike, and it's kind of continued since then. So a lot of the driving forces are like a lot of self-defense groups forming. You might have heard about this in Burkina Faso, Mali, and Nigeria. Communal violence, the hybridization with extremism, state military oppression, which is leading a lot of ethnic groups to arm themselves. To get to the types of violence, so this is not my coding. This is the ACLED coding for the subtype of event. So I took the 3 major types of violent events: explosions and remote violence, battles, and violence against civilians. And I map them. Fortunately, you don't see a lot. I mean, it's significant. I don't want to say it's not important, but the explosions and remote violence, that's a very new strategy that was introduced to West Africa in the last 20 years. The theory is that a lot of fighters who were fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan and other war zones kind of introduced it to the region. Fortunately, you don't see a lot of that, although it is increasing, and it's troubling. But battles and violence in civilians, you see quite a lot. Again, in these problematic region of Lake Chad and Central Sahel, you still see the bulk of it. Really shocking that some of the violence against civilians were some of the largest events in terms of fatalities. Again, this could be some of those communal massacres, some of these ethnic group clashes. But yeah, these are really disturbing that you have hundreds of civilians killed. And violence against civilians is increasing. The report led by my advisor, Dr. Walter, published this year, shows that violence against civilians is increasing. So this is another issue to look at. So hotspot analysis kind of confirms that there's these 2 major areas of pastoralist violence. Much of Nigeria, really, a lot of the country, kind of this band that moves from the southeast to the northwest, but quite a lot of Nigeria is just having problems. And then this the Central Sahel region, where it really has become transnational, right? So it's moved from Mali to Burkina Faso. It's now spreading into Niger, and you've had some stuff around the borders. There are things going on elsewhere, but again, if we want to focus our policy and looking at violence in the region, I think these two are really important. Just a really quick case study of Fulani. Again, it's a big name mentioned. They are a really sizable group, and they have been involved in violence in some of the region. They're active. Different groups are active in 12 countries. There were 15 unique groups, over 75 with the repetitions. So, if you consolidate, you get 15 groups. You do again see this problematic issue in Mali and Nigeria. So, later on, a lot of people are trying to understand this, but why is it happening here? What's going on? What's going on in the middle belt of Nigeria? What's going on in central Mali? Temporally, you see that pastoralist violence is increasing, which is a problem and something we should try to figure out. Before 2010, there just wasn't a lot of pastoralist violence. And some of these countries that we now think of as violent, as like Mali, like Niger, were very stable for decades. Mali was the darling of the international development community. It was incredibly stable. It was very developed politically, this has been a kind of recent trend where in the 2010s you have increasing pastoralists involved with violence, and it seems to be increasing. 2019, a lot of experts and scholars have said was the most violent year on record in some of these countries like Mali and Burkina Faso. So this is really problematic. And most importantly for this research, a larger share of all the violence is becoming associated with pastoralists. Some of these years it seems like 30 to 40%. Let's see. Okay, so last thing I want to talk about really quickly, sort of the tendency over time. Move this thing. Okay, so if we look at this is divided into 7-year periods. So the first one, 1997 to 2004, you see very little pastoralist violence. That's what I just said. You do see, again, maybe the emergence of kind of some issues in Mali and Nigeria, but not a lot of violence over a 7-year period. 2005 to 2012, it picks up a bit. But you see in the last 7 years, this last one in green dots, that it's just erupted into so much more than it ever was before. It's spread to more areas. It's become much more concentrated also in Nigeria and or Lake Chad and Central Sahel. So last thing I did was just want to talk about how has the kind of center of this central gravity or the mean area moved. In the early period, it's really concentrated in kind of southeastern or central Nigeria. It's moved slightly northeastward, again, as you get this inclusion of a lot of stuff in Mali and Burkina Faso. So you see this slight tendency for it to be moving toward this other area, which is something that we need more research on. Again, this border region here, Liptako Gorma, between Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, has gotten a lot of scholarship recently. But this area is really important. Central Mali is actually, you don't hear that much about it, but it's the breadbasket of Mali. It produces a lot of the agriculture and livestock. So this area is really important for security, and it can cause more problems. Once it's there, maybe it's going to spread to Algeria, to Benin, to Togo, and Ghana. So the fact that it's kind of shifted over time is really concerning and I think important for policy. All right, so some of the limitations here. There's more patterns you can look at in terms of the type of event, the type of actor. ACLA data is unfortunately disaggregated, so it's kind of difficult to examine continuity. In terms of the Mali War in 2012. It doesn't really look at it that way. It looks at individual events. There's always room for improving strategies for identifying pastoralists. It's really difficult. Who are pastoralists? When I first went through all the groups, I included a lot of groups that are not really considered pastoralists anymore, like Bedouin, for example. And the thing is, a lot of pastoralist groups are sedentarizing, and the other thing is, saying Fulani is pastoralist. Well, they estimate, only 30 or 40% of Fulani are pastoralists. Again, in the coding, you have these kind of code like pastoralists or Fulani ethnic militia. What does that really mean? Better way to deal with the iterations of the group. So how do we deal with this? Should we consolidate them to a single group? Should we really just treat them all as individual actors? And then there's a lot more potential for alliances and rivalries, networks, patterns in who, what, where, when pastoralists are involved. And of course, looking at the social dimension. So, why are they violent in these regions? So combining it with, qualitative work and looking at the greater, governmental, institutional, social kind of factors that are going on. Just want to quickly thank Dr. Walter, who helped me a ton with feedback, suggestions, and guidance. I got some help from an undergrad, Ermine Mansour, for help with going through all these groups, and she did a really great job. And thank you guys so much for listening.
All right, thank you, Matthew. We have plenty of time for questions, at least 12 more minutes before the official close of the colloquium. So anybody has a question, just jump right in.
Mike, I got a question.
Okay.
I can barely hear.
Hello, can you hear me?
It's kind of quiet.
Barely, Tim.
Yeah, how about this? Is that better?
Yeah.
Okay, Matthew, thank you for your talk. It's very complicated what you're doing. I mean, you've got things happening at different geographic scale. The analysis itself is carrying out at a very macro scale, but you've got these subcomponents or subregions, these hotspots that are emerging. Is there any commonalities in terms of what sparks violence or drives violence that you could just off the top of your head, I know as sort of a preliminary analysis, identify in terms of, people, I don't know, is there conflicts over land, over resources? Is there something that seems to be a commonality in the hotspots themselves? If you could pinpoint it to one or two things that would drive violence in that area, or is it such a heterogeneous kind of setting and situation that it almost defies, a depiction? So address that. I mean, is it,
Yeah.
do you see commonalities, or is it something that's so complex that you almost can't find commonalities?
Yeah, it's a really great question. No, I think there are commonalities, though I'd be reluctant to say, Central Mali, Middle Belt, Nigeria, oh, they're the same. But you have some similar groups and definitely some similar social issues that are going on in terms of tensions with other groups. So there are groups throughout, particularly Mali and Nigeria, that simply don't like pastoralists. So you have tensions with other groups. And again, there's so many reasons for that. So sometimes religion is cited. So quite a lot of pastoralists are Muslims. Sometimes they live with Christian groups. That's true in Middle Belt and Central Mali. Other times it's land. So farmer-herder conflicts has been around forever. And some people speculate that because of population growth, climate change, migration, all these factors, that it is increasing. The Middle Belt of Nigeria has just exploded, right? In 15 years, last 15 years. So there's a lot of factors for that. So you have the ethnic tensions with other groups. Then you have tensions with the state. Sometimes, it's pretty subdued. So when I worked in Cameroon, a lot of people didn't really like the Fulani who were there. They don't really consider them Cameroonian. They don't get along with them. They don't like their livestock. But there's not so much violence. There are tensions with the government. The government doesn't treat them that well. They don't respect their use of land. They don't issue them, birth certificates. They fine them a lot. But yeah, there's not so much violence. So in some of these places, the tensions with government seem to just erupt. And Mali, it's happened, in a series of rebellions since 1960. So you have one every 10 or 15 years. You have the Tuaregs and sometimes other groups trying to take over the government because they want sovereignty for their land. Interestingly, yeah, to maybe, I'm not answering your question, but interestingly, Mali and Niger are a good comparison because there are Tuaregs in both, but different things have happened. And there's some speculation to that. I could mention really quickly that Niger has not had outright rebellion by the Tuaregs. Some people say it's because they're treated better. So when Tuaregs went to fight under Gaddafi in Libya and came back to Mali, people speculate that they brought a lot of arms and some kind of animosity against the government, and that, you know, partially contributed to the revolution. In Niger, some people say that they were kind of integrated more into the country. There wasn't so much neglect by the government. There wasn't so much tension. So there was maybe some more political clout that was you know, either given to them or they, you know, fought for. So that comparison is really powerful for a lot of scholars, that you have similar group. Niger and Mali share some similarities in terms of, you know, religion, land, population, stuff like that. But yeah, very different outcomes.
Well, the reason I brought that up, if I may just have a few more minutes here or seconds, is that I think you've got things going on at various geographic scales, and some are more regional and some are more kind of localized things that you might want to take a look at. I think if you concentrate perhaps on the hotspots and the top 5 groups or the top 4 groups, whatever, and then try to tweak some of the stuff and see exactly what may be some sort of common threads that run through all this as a first start. Because I mean, ultimately, as social scientists involved in political geography, you're looking for ways not only to analyze something patterns, but, you know, if something could be done to, you know, mitigate this type of stuff going on. So anyways, I appreciate your talk. Thank you very much.
Oh, thanks for the advice.
Thanks, Tim. Anybody else? Jump on in again.
I have a question.
Go ahead, Audrey.
Matthew, thanks for your talk. Interesting. I was curious what, as you know, I've kind of been like looking into this literature a lot lately for a couple of side projects, and it, you know, seems to be framed a lot, as you mentioned, in resource scarcity, resource conflicts, climate change, land use, land cover change. But I was wondering, what are you thinking for your PhD research questions? Do you know, you're focusing on pastoralists. Are you framing it in a certain way? And to follow up on Dr. Fick's questions, have you thought like what kind of analysis you're going to do, what kind of covariates you might include, you know, like land tenure security, percent cropland or percent pasture land or things like that. I was just wondering if you could touch on a little bit. I'm just curious.
Yeah, thank you, Audrey. Yeah, am I supposed to keep my PhD topic a secret? I'm not sure. Or I just don't know. Yeah, no, in discussions with my my great advisor, you know, we've kind of come to idea that our focus, or my focus, I'm doing the PhD, my focus should be the response, so the strategies of pastoralists to political insecurity. So, and that can take a few different dimensions. Food security is a big one, and, you know, violence. So looking at the, you know, spatial and temporal dimensions of how they're responding to all this insecurity around them. So that'll kind of be the focus. Again, what kind of measurements and variables, we haven't really discussed it, but I think food security and violence are 2 major ones that, you know, are measurable. Violence with ACLED and food security with, you know, agricultural outputs, trade, what's going on with land, which is changing in parts of the Sahel. So those will probably be the 2 dimensions. But again, you know, Olivia and I, Olivia had a good idea about, you know, the strategy or adaptation, or however you want to call it, of how they're responding to what's going on around them, which I think is kind of the focus I'll take.
I have a question, Matthew.
Sure.
You mentioned climate change as an indicator when you were answering Tim's question. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more to that and how a drier climate across most of the region could be contributing or is not contributing to violence in the area.
Yeah, I'm reluctant to answer this because this is like the most contentious issue ever for people who study violence. So as far as I know, while there are people who, I'll just write 2 names that are, you know, associated with these theories. Oh, what's the other woman's name? Nancy Peluso, maybe? Peluso. Yeah, so there have been scholars who have written about the interaction between environmental change, I should say, environment and violence, and probably a lot more people who do not agree with that and have argued with them. So if you bring up Homer Dixon, who was one of the first people who came up with this, most people will laugh at you, as I've experienced. But yeah, so the evidence there is not proof conclusively, and a lot of people don't like this. And the interesting thing is they don't say that it's not true. What they say is it's not causative. So they say, oh, well, there's lots of parts of the world that have climate change or environmental change, and people aren't violent. So they're not saying that it doesn't contribute to it. What they don't like is saying, oh, it causes it, because it makes it seem very deterministic. Again, this is something I'm really interested in. I think, you look at, this is the most scarce part of the world in terms of environment. So these people are very vulnerable already. There are regular droughts, and there is climate change. I mean, look at Lake Chad. I'm sure most of you guys are familiar. Lake Chad is gone, right? So there's, I don't know, 60 million people who rely on this lake in Africa for fish and farming and water, and it's gone. To say that won't have any impact on their lives, I think is a bit absurd. But yeah, the thing people don't like, which I can accept, is like, environmental change causing violence. I think there's like some intervening or mitigating factors, which is good, because people do have free will. So to frame it as, oh, it's dry this year, everyone's killing each other, probably not the best way to put it. But yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting because people have looked at these mitigating factors. They look at like political stuff and I don't know, lifestyle stuff, and yeah, so I think we should look at that more. And this region is a really good place to look at it. As I mentioned, Mopti is like the breadbasket of Mali. So you have all this violence in the region that's like producing a lot of the goods, a lot of food for this country. Thanks.
And that's historically been a problem. The argument that climate change and climate really is not directly causing something. It's a thing we've faced for a lot of years too. So, anybody else? We have another minute. Well, at that, I'm going to say thank you, Matthew, again, and I'll stick around, and we'll stick around with the Zoom meeting for another few minutes after this. But I want to remind everybody, turn in your evaluation sheets so I'll know that you attended, and so we can give Matthew some feedback. I want to say that next week's speaker is Dr. Pat Serrano from Michigan State University, who's also working as a rotator at the National Science Foundation right now. Dr. Serrano kind of meets one of the sub-themes that I'm trying to talk about in this colloquium series of biologists doing geography and geographers doing biology. She's one of the biologists in our series this term. She and her team have put together a database of some 500,000 lakes in the conterminous US to study the local, regional, and continental scale factors of environmental change. She's mapped all these things. She's doing a lot of geography, environmental type geography. So everybody tune in next week for Dr. Serrano. She's also more or less my boss at the Division of Biological Infrastructure at NSF. So, but we'll keep this open for a few more minutes. And if anybody has any more questions for Matthew or anybody wants to discuss anything, we can stick around and do that. Otherwise,